There is a man named Josephus who watched Jerusalem burn. He had been born Jewish, raised in Jerusalem, trained as a priest, and had commanded rebel forces against Rome in the early years of the Jewish revolt. He had also, at a critical moment, switched sides. He surrendered to the Roman general Vespasian, predicted that Vespasian would become emperor, and when that prediction came true, found himself attached to the Roman military command as an advisor and translator, which meant that when Rome came to destroy the city where Josephus had grown up, the city that contained the temple his people had worshipped in for centuries, Josephus was standing in the Roman camp, watching it happen. He was close enough to shout through the walls to the defenders, close enough to see the fires start, close enough to record everything. His account, The Jewish War, is the most detailed description of a city's destruction that survives from the ancient world. And what it describes is not simply a military defeat. It is the systematic, engineered annihilation of a civilization's center, executed by the most powerful military machine in human history, operating at the peak of its capability. Today, we are going to walk through what actually happened in those 5 months in 70 AD. The engineering, the siege, the starvation, the fire, and the moment on a day in late August when everything the Jewish people had built their identity around for 1,000 years ceased to exist. Let's start with the military situation in April of 70 AD. 4 years earlier, in 66 AD, the Jewish population of Judea had revolted against Roman rule. The rebellion had spread quickly, and the Roman response had been slow. The Roman governor of Syria, Cestius Gallus, marched on Jerusalem and was repulsed, a humiliation that shocked Rome and emboldened the rebels across the region. Emperor Nero responded by dispatching one of his most experienced generals, a rough-edged military man named Vespasian, to crush the revolt. Vespasian spent the years 67 and 68 systematically destroying rebel strongholds across Galilee and the Jordan Valley. Then Nero died. Rome plunged into a year of civil war, with 4 different emperors in rapid succession. The Jewish campaign stalled. When Vespasian emerged from that chaos as emperor, he handed the final campaign to his son, Titus. Titus arrived outside the walls of Jerusalem in April of 70 AD, with 4 full Roman legions, the 5th Macedonian, the 10th Fretensian, the 12th Fulminatan, and the 15th Apollinarian. Scholars estimate the total force at somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 men, including auxiliary troops. It was one of the largest military forces Rome had ever assembled for a single siege. Inside Jerusalem, the situation was catastrophic, and not because of the Romans. The city was divided between 3 competing Jewish factions who had spent the previous months fighting each other. John of Gischala controlled the Temple Mount. Simon Bar Giora controlled most of the rest of the city. A third faction under Eleazar ben Simon controlled the inner courts of the temple itself. These 3 groups had been burning each other's food stores, assassinating each other's leaders, and killing each other's soldiers throughout the winter, before Titus arrived. And then there was the population problem. Titus had timed his arrival for Passover. Pilgrims from across the Jewish world had flooded into Jerusalem for the festival, and some estimates placed the population of the city at that moment at over 1 million people. When Titus sealed the walls, all of them were trapped inside. 1 million people. 3 factions fighting each other. Food stores already depleted by months of civil war. And outside the walls, the finest army in the world. Now, let's talk about how Rome actually conducted a siege, because this is the engineering that most history accounts skip past too quickly. Roman siege warfare was not simply surrounding a city and waiting. It was a precise engineering discipline, developed and refined over centuries, that involved the systematic construction of offensive infrastructure on a scale that is difficult to comprehend without seeing the numbers. The first thing Titus did was establish his camps. 4 legions meant 4 separate fortified camps positioned around the city. Connected by roads his engineers cut through the terrain. Trees for miles around Jerusalem were cut down to clear sight lines, build siege equipment, and construct the camps themselves. Josephus records that within a short time, the hills around Jerusalem, which had been covered in orchards and gardens, were stripped completely bare. Then came the circumvallation wall, to prevent anyone from leaving the city and to prevent any supplies from entering. Titus ordered his engineers to construct a wall, completely encircling Jerusalem. This wall was approximately 7 kilometers long, nearly 4.5 miles, with 13 guard towers positioned along its length. According to Josephus, the Roman engineers completed this wall in 3 days. Modern scholars debate whether that timeline is accurate, but even if it took somewhat longer, building a wall 7 kilometers long in a matter of days by an army in the field is a feat of organized 7 kilometers engineering that is almost incomprehensible. With the circumvallation wall complete, Jerusalem was sealed. Nothing in, nothing out. The mathematics of the siege had now taken over. 1 million people, depleted food stores, and no possibility of resupply. Time was the Romans' most powerful weapon. Inside the city, what followed was beyond description. Josephus, who had access to eyewitness accounts from survivors and his own observations from the Roman side of the wall, records the progression of the famine in detail that becomes increasingly difficult to read. The food ran out in stages. First the stored grain, then the hidden reserves, then animals that would normally never be eaten. Josephus records people tearing leather from their shields and boiling it. He also records people searching sewers for scraps. Scenes of violence over individual handfuls of grain, and a woman named Mary, driven to complete madness by starvation, who did something so terrible that Josephus describes it and then immediately says he wishes he had not written it. Famine had stripped the city of its humanity. Beyond the hunger, the factions continued fighting each other inside the walls. Josephus describes bodies being thrown over the walls by the thousands, people killed by famine, by disease, by internal violence, until the valleys around Jerusalem were filled and the smell reached the Roman camps. Titus, riding around the walls to survey the siege, encountered this sight, and is recorded as raising his hands and calling God as his witness that this was not his doing. Titus confronted a scene of total collapse. Meanwhile, the engineering continued. Roman siege warfare relied on a series of engineered assault platforms called siege ramps. These were not simply piled dirt. They were constructed earthworks, using thousands of tons of material, built up to the height of the city walls to allow siege towers and battering rams to be brought into contact with the fortifications. The construction of a single siege ramp against a well-defended city wall was a massive engineering undertaking, measured in weeks. Siege ramps changed the geometry of the battlefield. Titus ordered 4 ramps built simultaneously against the walls of the Antonia fortress, the massive structure that adjoined the Temple Mount on its north side. The defenders on the walls rained arrows, stones, and fire down on the construction crews continuously. The Romans responded with their own artillery, bolt throwers and stone-throwing engines called ballistae, suppressing the defenders while the earthworks rose. Antonia was under constant assault. Then, in a moment, Josephus describes as one of the most impressive feats of the entire defense, the Jewish fighters inside the Antonia executed a plan that had been prepared weeks in advance. They had secretly dug a tunnel running directly beneath the Roman siege ramp. They packed this tunnel with pitch and bitumen and set it on fire. The tunnel collapsed. The ground beneath the ramp gave way, and the entire structure, weeks of engineering work and the siege towers positioned on top of it, fell into the burning pit. Collapse turned months of labor into ruin. It was a significant setback, but it was temporary. Titus rebuilt. He ordered a new circumvallation, Additional ramps intensified artillery fire, and he made a decision that changed the nature of the siege. He would starve the city faster by building his wall tighter and cutting off even the smallest possibility of anyone slipping out for food. Circumvallation sealed the fate of the city. The famine inside Jerusalem was now completing the work that Roman engineering had started. By late July, the Antonia fortress fell in a night assault. Roman soldiers climbed the walls in the darkness, overwhelmed the sleeping defenders, and within hours had a foothold on the Temple Mount itself. The fighting that followed in the courtyards of the temple complex was some of the most intense urban combat of the entire campaign. And then, on the 9th day of the month of Av in the Jewish calendar, a date the Jewish tradition had already marked as the anniversary of the destruction of the first temple by Babylon 6 centuries earlier, the fire started. The question of whether Titus ordered the temple burned or whether it happened in the chaos of battle remains a historical debate. Josephus, who was present on the Roman side, claims that Titus wanted to preserve the temple, and that a Roman soldier threw a burning torch into one of the lower chambers against explicit orders. Most modern historians are skeptical of this account, noting that Josephus had strong political reasons to protect Titus's reputation. What is not disputed is what happened next. The fire caught in the dry summer heat of August. The cedar beams of Herod's temple, some of the largest structural timbers in the ancient world, fed flames that spread faster than anyone could control. Josephus describes the defenders abandoning their positions and rushing toward the temple as it burned, fighting not to defend the city, but simply to try to reach the sacred space one last time. The gold in the temple melted in the heat and ran down between the stones of the walls. Roman soldiers, seeing molten gold seeping from the walls, began prying the stones apart to get to it. This is the physical reality behind the words of Jesus recorded in the Gospels 40 years before this moment, when he looked at Herod's temple and said that not one stone would be left upon another. The soldiers pried every stone apart, looking for gold. The temple that Herod had spent decades building, the structure that Josephus described as glowing so brightly in the sun that it was painful to look at directly, was gone in a day. What followed was the destruction of the rest of the city. Titus, after the temple burned, offered terms to the remaining defenders. They could surrender and be spared. The rebel leaders Simon Bar-Giora and John of Gischala refused. They demanded safe passage to the desert. Titus, offended, ended negotiations. The Roman legions swept through what remained of Jerusalem, street by street, district by district. Josephus records that the soldiers eventually grew tired of killing, not from mercy, but from exhaustion. There were too many people to kill efficiently. The streets were filled with bodies. The survivors were separated. Those who could fight were killed. Those who were young and healthy were taken for slavery. Children were sold. The elderly and infirm were killed where they stood. Josephus records over 1 million killed during the siege. Modern historians consider this number an exaggeration, but agree the death toll was in the hundreds of thousands. 97,000 survivors were taken as slaves. The young and healthy among them were sent to Egypt to work in the mines or to the Roman arenas to fight as gladiators. Others were taken to Rome to be displayed in Titus's triumph. The plunder from the temple, the golden menorah, the table of showbread, the sacred trumpets, was carried through Rome in a triumphal procession that is commemorated to this day on the Arch of Titus, where Roman soldiers are shown carrying the menorah through the streets of the capital. Titus ordered the entire city demolished. Every building was pulled down. Every street was cleared. The 3 towers of Herod's palace were left standing as testimony to what Roman power had overcome. Everything else was erased. The city of Jerusalem, which had been continuously inhabited for thousands of years, which had been the capital of David's kingdom, and the home of Solomon's temple, and the center of Jewish religious life for a millennium, was reduced to rubble in September of 70 AD. And here is the detail that connects all of it back to the beginning of this story. Josephus was standing in the Roman camp when the temple burned. The man who had been born Jewish, who had commanded Jewish forces, who had walked the streets of Jerusalem as a young man, and had prayed in the temple he was now watching burn, recorded everything. In the middle of his account of the carnage, he pauses and writes something that stops the reader cold. He writes that as he watched the city burn, he thought of all the times the prophets had warned that this would happen, that Isaiah and Jeremiah and others had said, centuries earlier, that if Israel abandoned God, God would allow their city and their temple to be destroyed. Josephus was not a devout man by the end of his life. He had made choices that his own people would never forgive. But standing in a Roman camp watching Jerusalem burn, he found himself returning to the ancient texts and writing that what he was seeing was not simply a Roman military victory. It was the fulfillment of something that had been written down long before Titus was born. 40 years before the siege, a Jewish teacher from Galilee had stood on the Mount of Olives, looked across at Herod's temple in its full gleaming glory, and told his disciples that the day was coming when not one stone would be left upon another. His disciples had been astonished. The temple was the most magnificent structure in the world. Who could destroy it? Titus could, and he did. But the teacher's other words, that he himself would rise from the dead, that the kingdom of God was coming, that the temple made of stone would be replaced by something that could not be destroyed. Those words were still circulating, still spreading, still reaching new cities and new people, while the stones of the temple were being pried apart for their gold. Rome destroyed everything it intended to destroy in 70 AD. The walls, the buildings, the temple, the political structure, the priesthood. The message kept going. Which part of this siege surprised you most? The scale of the Roman engineering, the internal Jewish conflict that weakened the defense, the famine inside the walls, or the connection to what Jesus had predicted 40 years earlier? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe to Bible Vault. Every week, we go deeper into the real history behind the stories that shaped the world.